Right. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, students, colleagues at the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies, welcome. Welcome back to yet another fascinating, thought-provoking, intellectual, exciting discussion that we are able to bring to you and to your screens. Depending on where you're joining us from, of course, good morning, good afternoon, and very nice good evening to you if you're joining us, as I see many familiar faces from Israel. And certainly our speaker this evening, Dr. Jonathan Ghariani, is also joining us from Israel himself. My name is Csaba Nikolenyi. I teach political science at Concordia University, and it's been my honor and privilege to also direct the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies for 10 years now. This is a very special year as we celebrate one complete decade of the Institute's operation activities on the campus of Montreal's beautiful Concordia University. We are truly fortunate to be able to welcome Dr. Ghariani as our visiting scholar, unfortunately only in a virtual sense. Dr. Ghariani is a specialist of international relations. He completed his undergraduate and master's education in Israel, an undergraduate degree at ITC Herzliya, a graduate degree at Tel Aviv University, and in the year 2020, he completed his doctoral dissertation on the Middle Eastern peace process at the University College of London. Dr. Ghariani has had various research positions at appointments in Israel and abroad, and we were very, very happy to be able to recruit him and have him spend some time with us at the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies. Dr. Ghariani recently presented a fascinating paper about the diplomatic history of Israel and the Middle East at the annual meeting of the European Association of Israel Studies that was just at the beginning of this week, virtually hosted out of Bucharest, of all places. Dr. Ghariani's current interest is in the history of multilateralism, the multilateral track, the multilateral approach to peace in the Middle East, specifically in Israel's diplomatic efforts of bringing peaceful relations to fruition and to completion. And there could be no better time to have this talk than today, this particular month, since we are celebrating, or marking at least, even if we are not celebrating, the 30th anniversary of the Madrid peace process, which was, of course, an extremely, extremely important chapter in the history of Israel's multilateral diplomatic efforts. So without further ado, I am going to turn if not the floor, but the screen over to Dr. Ghariani, who is going to tell us about Israel's diplomatic relations with Morocco and Oman, bringing us all the way to the current exciting chapter and the opportunities that the Abraham Accords are providing. Dr. Ghariani, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Csaba, for this introduction. So good evening, everyone. Good afternoon for those who are joining us from Canada, and good evening for those who are joining us from Europe and Israel. So I will, just a second, I will share my screen. I think you'll be able to see it in a second. 1 second. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Great. So yes, so I will today I will be talking about the diplomatic histories of Israel's relations with Oman and Morocco, from covert relations to the Abraham Accords. The first part of my presentation will discuss the Morocco's Israel's relations, and the second part we will address the Israel's relation with Oman. So Israel's relation with Oman started in 1963 when the head of the Mossad, the then head of the Mossad, Meir Hamit, established a line of communication with his Moroccan counterparts, General Mohammed Oufkir. The relationship initially was very much centered around the security arena, as Morocco had at this time tense relations with Algeria and Egypt, given the fact that Cairo and Algeria supported Moroccan opposition groups and provided them with shelter. And as a result of that, given that Israel also saw Algeria and Egypt as enemies and adversaries, Israel provided military assistance to Morocco in the form of armed sales. For instance, Israel provided Morocco with light tanks AMX-13 via Iran, but also light weapons, and as well as training tank crews, as well as other military personnel, such as fighter pilots. Israel trained Moroccan MiG-17 fighter pilots and improved their skills in natural combat. But also intelligence sharing. Israel provided intelligence on Egypt and Algeria. And this is actually one of the main reasons why Mayor Hamid actually thought that it is a major opportunity to take the relationship to the next level, to further improve it. He actually thought that the rift between Egypt and Morocco was indeed a significant opportunity for that rapprochement. And in a way, we could say that the Moroccan-Israeli clandestine ties could be interpreted as an extension of Ben Gurion doctrine of the periphery. At this time in the 1950s, David Ben Gurion put forward his policy of establishing ties with non-Arab Muslim states such as Iran and Turkey, but also Christian states who are in the vicinity, such as Ethiopia. And Morocco, in a way, is very much fits this very much in line with the doctrine of the periphery, given the fact that we had converging interests at the time, and the countries that I've mentioned before, Iran, Turkey, but also Ethiopia. So Nasser, 64, General Oufkir secretly visited Israel to attend the Pope visit to Israel and monitor the security arrangements made for the Pope visit. And when he returned to Morocco and met with the king, the king actually gave his blessing, his approval for Israel being in charge of all the security arrangements in the palace, and also King Hassan II fully approved the permanent Israeli presence in Morocco. But the relationship actually was not necessarily confined to the military arena, as actually both Morocco and Israel cooperated in the field of agriculture. For instance, Israel and Morocco held talks on the potential sale of citrus to Israel. And the Moroccan agricultural minister at the time made a secret visit to Israel and met with Moshe Dayan to learn about Israel's expertise in agriculture. So in a way, we could say that this actually could be interpreted as a kind of proto-normalization between Israel and Morocco, and in a way, premonition to the Abraham Accords. But moving forward, because we are more limited in time, in 1973, the relationship between Morocco and Israel cooled down as Rabat sent a token number of forces to the Arab coalition, which were fighting in the Yom Kippur War on the Golan Heights in the Syrian front. But that participation was token, and it did not actually hinder relation between Morocco and Israel in the long run. And in that spirit, in 1976, Moroccan public statements started to praise the common roots between Judaism and Islam as being Abrahamic religion, but also supported a comprehensive Arab-Israeli peace, hinted about the potential role that Morocco could take as a facilitator between Israel and the Arab states. And in that context, Yitzhak Rabin made a secret visit to Morocco in 1976, where he met with King Hassan II. And the two leaders talk about the potential Moroccan role as a facilitator between Israel and the Arab states. And subsequently in 1977, Menachem Begin won the election. And in contrast to Prime Minister Rabin, have a more hawkish views when it comes to the issue of settling the territories. But nevertheless, the line of communication was kept intact. And in August 1977, General Yitzhak Hofi, who now headed the Mossad, secretly met again with King Hassan, and King Hassan gave a message cable from Sadat to Hofi, in which Sadat stated his eagerness to start negotiations with Israel under Moroccan facilitation. Hassan also stated that he was eager to play that role as a facilitator, and Begin actually acquiesced to that request. And a meeting took place on September 16, 1977, between the then Foreign Minister Moshe Dayan and Egyptian Vice Premier Hassan al-Tuami in Marrakesh. The meeting took place in Marrakesh. The meeting was highly secretive. In the Egyptian side, only 3 persons knew about it. Vice Premier Tuami and Sadat, of course, but also Hosni Mubarak. Even the Americans were not aware of that meeting. The Egyptians stated that they would be willing to meet with Menachem Begin in Morocco. That actually Sadat would be willing to meet with Menachem Begin in Morocco, provided that Israel commit to a full withdrawal from Sinai. Moshe Dayan actually stated that Begin would be actually willing to meet with Sadat, but did not give any commitment to an Israeli withdrawal. While the Egyptians' position, the Egyptian narrative stated that Begin actually committed to a full withdrawal, and here actually there is difference of interpretation with regards to that event. Also, they discussed the potentiality of normalization of relations between Israel and Egypt, and Hassan al-Tuami stated that Egypt would be willing to normalize relations with Israel within 5 years after Israel completes the withdrawal from Sinai. But King Hassan criticized Hassan al-Tuami lack of flexibility and stated that his position is actually creating more obstacles in the negotiations. So the meeting actually ended without formal agreement, but it was quite important as King Hassan actually suggested that initially there were supposed to be a further agreement between Hassan al-Tuami and Moshe Dayan, but King Hassan suggested that there should be a meeting between Menachem Begin and Anwar al-Sadat, provided, of course, that Israel withdrew from all the Sinai Peninsula. But given the fact that the details of the meeting were leaked to the press, leaked by the Israeli press, King Hassan actually was furious about it and canceled the eventuality of meeting between Sadat and Begin in Morocco. But nevertheless, 2 months after that back-channel negotiation, of course, President Sadat visited Jerusalem, made a speech to the Knesset, and met with Menachem Begin and leader of the opposition, Golda Meir. But a second round of negotiations in Marrakesh took place on December 1977. Well, this time again, Hassan al-Tuami stated again that Egypt would accept nothing less than a full Israeli withdrawal from all of the Sinai Peninsula up to the 1967 boundaries. And Moshe Dayan actually stated that he would be willing to withdraw from the bulk of the Sinai Peninsula, but is looking to keep the settlements in the Sinai Peninsula, as well as the military airfields, which would be under Israeli civilian administration under UN supervision. Of course, King Hassan and Hassan al-Tuami rejected that proposition, but on the Palestinian issue, actually, there were some convergence between Israel and Hassan, as Hassan understood that the PLO actually was at the time considered as a threat to both the security of Israel and Egypt, and that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should be solved within the framework of a pan-Arab, within the framework of a pan-Arab consensus, but not necessarily within a bilateral discussion. So moving forward, Moshe Dayan, at the end of the meeting, convey a message to King Hassan, stating that Menachem Begin was looking forward to meet with the king. And the king actually replied that he's looking forward to it as well, but it never materialized given, of course, the political situation at the time. Now, there is a debate whether the visit itself played a role or actually shaped Sadat's decision to visit Jerusalem. Dayan and Tuami are adamant about it. It did actually play a role in influencing Sadat to visit Jerusalem. But Boutros Ghali actually would become the Egyptian foreign minister later on and played a major role in the Israeli-Egyptian Camp David Accords. Refuted the argument and stated Sadat had not made, that Sadat did not decide to visit Jerusalem in accordance with after actually the meeting in Marrakesh, that this meeting did not shape his decision to travel to Jerusalem. I believe that it's played a major role, but it wasn't the only factor. I also believe that Nicolae Ceausescu also played an indirect facilitating role between Sadat and Begin, convinced Sadat that Begin was the trustworthy partner, and that negotiations could take place between Egypt and Israel, direct negotiations, and that Sadat should make his bold move in order to move the status quo. So moving on, the meeting actually was far more substantive than the previous one, and it showed that actually Morocco's relations with both sides, both Egypt and Israel, help actually break the psychological barrier that existed between Israel and Egypt, and could potentially we could foresee Morocco playing a role between Israel and the PA in subsequent final status negotiations. So now we'll discuss Shimon Peres' visit to Morocco in 1986, on July 22nd, 1986. Even a year before, King Hassan was eager to meet with Shimon Peres, and in a few months before the official visit took place, he envisaged inviting Arab leaders with Israeli leaders in Morocco to discuss a kind of international peace summit. But that idea was rejected by the Arab leaders, and therefore King Hassan moved forward with the visit. And it was indeed, the visit was of historic proportions, given the fact that it is the first official meetings between an Israeli prime minister and an Arab leader. In the past, there were such meetings, but they were secret. They were kept from the public eye. And even Shimon Peres himself stated that he visited Morocco in 1978 and 1981. And as Professor Bruce Mehdi-Weissman stated, this actually showed that Morocco's always had an independent foreign policy, which stood in sharp contrast with the Arab states. But nevertheless, there were still some differences of opinions between Israel and Morocco, especially with regards to the role of the PLO. At the time, King Hassan was committed to the 1982 Fez Summit commitment that to the PLO being the sole and legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, which was in fact a reiteration of the 1974 summit, which granted the PLO that role. So there were some, as I said before, there were some cleavages on the issue of the PLO, and King Hassan was a bit disappointed by the fact that Shimon Peres did not, at this stage, did not envisage any negotiations with the PLO. He rejected the possibility. Both Labour and Likud were opposed to negotiating with the PLO, which was at the time considered by Israel as a terrorist organization, and they could not negotiate with it at this stage. But nevertheless, the line of communication was kept open even after the visit. And in 1987, Shimon Peres wrote a letter, which I retrieved from the Israeli National Archives, where he again talked about the potentiality for regional conference, an international conference, a peace conference, which will include Israel and the Arab states. But again, reiterated his opposition to have the PLO taking part in that negotiations, given the fact that, according to Shimon Peres, this will also jeopardize Jordan's position in the negotiations, and therefore was opposed to any PLO role in the negotiations. He stated that he will send his their common friend Rafi Edri, who previously actually organized the summit between, helped organize the summit between King Hassan and Shimon Peres, and that he will actually Rafi Edri will debrief King Hassan about the details of the international conference that King Hussein and Shimon Peres have agreed under the London Agreement of 1987. So moving actually forward again, also in the letter, Shimon Peres stated his support for a regional committee on agriculture, which will include Egypt, Jordan, Israel, and Morocco, and these four countries will cooperate on issues pertaining to agriculture. That was actually Shimon Peres' proposal. But in 1989, in accordance with the rotation agreement, Yitzhak Shamir replaced Shimon Peres as prime minister. And but again, the line of communication were kept open, and King Hassan held a discussion from the conversation with Yitzhak Shamir, in which the king tried to convince in vain that Yitzhak Shamir should negotiate with the PLO. Shamir, of course, was adamant and rejected any negotiation with the PLO at this stage. Moving on, actually, because we have limited time, I will now discuss the Oslo period. I will not yet touch tackle the Madrid conference. We'll discuss it when we'll talk about Oman-Israel relation. So the real breakthrough actually occurred after the Declaration of Principle, or the signing of the Declaration of Principle, or also known as the Oslo Accords. Rabin actually again met with King Hassan just after the signing of the Accords. During which Rabin asked His Majesty his advice on how to further the normalization between Israel and the Arab states. And subsequently to that visit, Rabin sent his advisor Jacques Neria and Rafi Edri to meet with the king and also debrief the king about the peace process. But most important of all, after the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty, Morocco-Israel relations gained further momentum, and King Hassan actually organized the Casablanca MENA conference on issues pertaining to economic and business. And for the first time, the Arab states were fully committed to peace. The secondary and tertiary boycott were abrogated by the Gulf states, which was indeed something significant. And subsequently, Israel and Morocco agreed to establish partial diplomatic relations, liaison office or interest bureau. Tourism also increased significantly during this period, as 20,000 Israeli tourists visited annually Morocco. The trade also was amounted to $2 million volume annually. But this is actually not certain, but there were some reports that also the security cooperation was taken to the next level, was significantly upgraded, and that Israel actually provided armed sales, as we saw it before, but also upgraded Morocco's fleet of F-5E combat aircraft. Moving forward, when actually King Hassan II passed away on July 26, 1999, Ehud Barak, the Israeli Prime Minister, then Israeli Prime Minister, former Prime Minister Shimon Peres, and David Levy, the then Foreign Minister, who is of Moroccan origin, attended his funeral. But unfortunately, given the deterioration of the situation in the Middle East, the end of the peace process, but also the second intifada and the violent waves of violence and terrorism. On October 24th, 2000, Rabat, along with Qatar, Tunisia, and Oman, recalled all its diplomats from Israel and severed diplomatic relations with Jerusalem. Now, the fact that Morocco actually facilitated discussions between Israel and Egypt in 1977 demonstrates its ability to play a facilitating role between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. It is actually even reinforced by the fact that Morocco's role granted by the Organization of Islamic Conference to oversee the Islamic shrines in Jerusalem. Rabat could actually play a role in final status negotiations, particularly on the issue of Jerusalem. And that might actually be very helpful in that endeavor, perhaps adding other countries such as Jordan and Saudi Arabia as well. So moving on now, I will discuss Israel's relation with Oman. Israel actually established first contact with Muscat in 1975 when Israel provided military assistance to Oman, during which they were under insurrection of the Dhofar Marxist rebellion. Israel sent a military advisory group to support Oman military to curb that insurrection. But much like with Morocco, also the relationship was not necessarily confined to the security arena. There were discussions between Oman and Israel on the issue of water desalination and irrigation drip. But most important of all, in 1978, when Israel and Egypt signed the Camp David Accord, Oman supported that agreement and the subsequent Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. And Oman actually was, along with Sudan and Morocco, as we discussed it before, the only country which did not sever diplomatic relations with Israel. And even actually in 1987, when the Arab states resumed diplomatic relations with Egypt, Muscat pressured the Arab states to reinstate Egypt in the Arab League and move its headquarters back from Tunis to Cairo. So yes, Oman's actually support for the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty should be interpreted as Sultan Qaboos' ability to balance relations with every state in the region. He always actually maintained an independent foreign policy. For instance, he established ties with Israel, but also with Iran, and even played a facilitating role between Iran and the United States in 2013, but we'll discuss it later. Also in 1980, much like with the case of Morocco, Oman, Sultan Qaboos actually held a line of communication with Mossad operative, who were actually discussing regional issues such as the Iranian threat, the Iranian revolution, as well as the Soviet influence in the region. Moving on, in 1991, President George Herbert Walker Bush Sr. convened the Madrid Peace Conference, which for the first time included the multilateral forum, where actually Oman played a very important role, especially on water desalination. And in April 1993, Oman was the first country to suggest that Israel should play a leading role in that endeavor, and proposed a Middle East Research Center for Water Desalination, MEDRC, which was unveiled in 1996 and is still functioning until today. And they actually deal with water scarcity in the region. And it also served as a venue for discussions between Israeli and Omanese diplomats, although they have actually broken relations in 2000. But actually the first, I would say the first major event which led to the rapprochement between Oman and Israel and establishment of official diplomatic relations, I think, is Rabin's visit to Muscat in December 1994, and the fact that although actually initially Muscat was reluctant to established relations. They would eventually, at some point, establish partial diplomatic relations on September 1995 in the form of trade office. Also, when Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated on November 1995, Yusuf Ben Alawi, who was then the foreign minister, attended Rabin's funeral. And also, in 1984, I forgot to mention, it's much like its previous support for the Camp David Accords and the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. Oman welcomed the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty, and they will actually do so subsequently in whenever actually there is an agreement between Israel and the Arab states. Yes, as I mentioned, but unfortunately, the relationship started to take a negative turn when Prime Minister Netanyahu actually in 1996 was elected, but also the Western Wall tunnel incidents, where actually the Netanyahu government decided to open the northern exit of the Western Wall, created a crisis between Israel and the Arab states. And Oman actually froze all diplomatic relations with Israel, condemned Israel action. And again, it's actually started to align itself more with the Arab states and started to increase its support for the Palestinians. For instance, in 1998, they actually opened a Palestinian embassy, and the first Palestinian ambassador to Muscat was welcomed by Sultan Qaboos. But the election of Ehud Barak actually led to an improvement in the relationship between Muscat and Israel. Oman welcomed the election of Ehud Barak, but again, Muscat was much more hesitant in moving forward in improving relations with Israel, and conditioned any potential improvement of relations or any warming of relations on progress in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. And this actually has become Muscat policy until today, as we will see. But unfortunately, after the failure of the Camp David summit and the outbreak of the Second Intifada, the four Arab countries, Morocco, Qatar, Tunisia, and Oman, all severed diplomatic relations with Israel in accordance with the Arab League decision to do so. But despite the fact that actually Oman did froze relations with Israel, they still actually maintain some level of contacts. And Benjamin Netanyahu actually visited Muscat on October 2018. Where actually he met with Sultan Qaboos, and they discussed actually regional issues together with the head of the Mossad, Yossi Cohen, the then head of the Mossad, Yossi Cohen. And this actually visit is very important, as unlike the Abraham Accords, the Palestinian Authority has not denounced the agreement. The visit, sorry. The main reason is that Oman officially is still supportive of the Arab Peace Initiative. They stated that they will not normalize relations with Israel unless Israel accepts the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002. This initiative stipulates that the Arab states will not normalize relations with Israel until Israel withdraws from all the territories, and that, of course, was not accepted by Israel until today, given the fact that it is interpreted as a diktat. When actually the Abraham Accords were signed, Oman again supported the agreement. They even actually sent representatives to emphasize that they fully support the agreement. But nevertheless, they remain committed to the Arab Peace Initiative, and again and then maintain their policy of non-normalization until Israel make significant progress in the peace process. So Muscat position in the region is highly unique. As I mentioned before, it has a relation with all the parties, all the belligerent parties. Muscat played a role in 2013 in facilitating discussions between John Kerry and his Iranian counterpart, Zarif. It is possible to envisage that Muscat will play a significant role in any multilateral peace process. They have proven so in the Madrid multilateral negotiations, where they played a role in water desalination. Now actually I'll move to the conclusion. Yes, to repeat what I've stated earlier, I believe that Israel's relation with Oman and Morocco could be considered as an extension of the alliance of the periphery, supported by David Ben-Gurion. Both Morocco and Oman were the first to support peace between Israel and the Arab states. And they have actually the ability to facilitate discussions between belligerents, as proven by King Hassan's decision to facilitate discussions between Israel and Egypt in 1977 in Marrakesh, and the fact that they have supported every agreement and highly actually support this position. In a way, we can actually link it to the current geopolitical context, as this relationship, these clandestine ties, the context in which these clandestine ties were established bears many similarities to the current context, where the current geopolitical landscape, and we can see today that there is a convergence of interest between Israel and the Arab states with regards to Iran, which actually culminated in the Abraham Accords. But even before that, you could see relations between Israel and the Arab states growing on multiple levels, mainly security, but not only restricted to that arena. Also, Morocco could play a role in final status negotiations between Israel and the PA. For instance, Jerusalem, as I've mentioned in that presentation, Morocco was granted by the Organization of Islamic Conference a special role of guardianship or custodianship in the issue of the Holy Shrines of Jerusalem, Islamic Holy Shrines in Jerusalem, and perhaps could play that facilitating role between Israel and the Palestinian Authority on this thorny issue. Oman also, as I mentioned in the presentation, could facilitate talks between Israel and the PA, as on water desalination. As I've said before, they took a very important role in water desalination. They were the first to support the idea of water desalination, and Israel taking a leading role in it, but also facilitated talks between Iran and the United States. And it certainly can play a primary role in any regional peace between Israel and the Arab states. And that's all. Thank you very much for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jonathan. We have a good amount of time, at least 20 minutes for a Q&A. And what I would like to ask members of the audience, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I will try to keep a vigilant eye on the chat box, and we'll try to share all the questions and comments coming in with Jonathan. And just to maybe get the conversation rolling, I would like to fire away 2 quick questions to you, Jonathan. The first one is the puzzle. Given all this complicated but nonetheless long and well-established history of relations, clandestine as they may have been for a good period of time, there had been relations between Israel and these 2 countries. Yet these were not the states that ended up being in the vanguard of signing and normalizing with Israel earlier on or even now. So why the resistance? I understand all the potentials that you explained, but why the resistance? Why the UAE? Why Bahrain, but not Oman, and so forth? And my second question is about the periphery, the strategy of the periphery that you very interestingly showed and anchored your historical discussion in the Ben-Gurion's concept of the creating, looking for allies beyond the enemies who are surrounding the nation. Is that clearly you consider the periphery strategy still relevant? Is it still relevant today? And why do you think it is? It seems that Israel is no longer surrounded by enemies. Certainly Egypt, Jordan are, if not friends, there is definitely cold peace with them. So what's the point of looking now for allies on the periphery when we can have them closer to the national homeland? And then we have more questions coming in. So
regarding your first question regarding Oman, Oman actually positioned initially was one of the first countries to support Israel peace with the Arab states. It also actually played a major role in the multilateral discussions. But given the fact that their position changed after the, I would say by 1986, when Netanyahu came to office, and from then on, they started to balance it more and make it more aligned with the Arab League, which means that they now reiterate their commitment to a two-state solution, to the establishment of a Palestinian state before there could be normalization, and they always actually reiterate this as their official policy. I think they are. This might change actually in the future. Where I just read an article in the Jerusalem Post from quoting an Israeli official who stated that Oman will be the next in line to normalize relations with Israel. Therefore, we could expect Oman to be a contender for a future normalization agreement. But they haven't. They are more reluctant. I think they are more cautious. I would say this is why they are not doing so. Perhaps out of I feel that the public opinion will not follow. That's why they want normalized relations with Israel at this point, unlike Bahrain and the UAE. And also they have a relationship with Iran. I think this also is a factor which might hinder the or slow the process of normalization between Israel and Oman. But again, we never know. In the future, there might be the first Arab country to normalize relations, and they have supported every single Arab-Israeli agreement since 1978. As for your second question, actually, regarding the periphery, I think it is now a reverse. In the past, Turkey and Iran, for instance, used to be Israel's main ally in the fight against Nasserism or Syria's Ba'ath Party. Now it's quite the opposite, actually. I think Turkey and Iran are, I would say, the belligerent parties, while actually the UAE, Jordan, the UAE, Saudi Arabia and Egypt are now part of the strategic partnership we established. It's a kind of a reversal of that periphery doctrine.
Great, thank you very much. Jonathan, the next question is from Professor David Bensoussan, who's joining us, I think, from Montreal. And Professor Bensoussan's question is as follows. How did the Moroccan population react to these accords with Israel? Is there today a full diplomatic relation between the two countries, Israel and Morocco?
The population actually, you mean the Abraham Accords, right? Not the.
Yeah.
So it's hard to actually tell at this point. I think the population is in line with the decision of King Mohammed VI's decision to partially normalize relations with Israel. These relationships are not full diplomatic relations yet. They are mainly at the stage of liaison office, but it is expected that Morocco and Israel will fully normalize relations in the near future.
Great, thank you very much. There is a very important, very nice comment from Ms. Lillian Weinberg-Goodman, who is a very strong supporter and friend of the Institute in Montreal. Lillian's comment is as follows. Excellent presentation. Did you know of the major role that Professor Irving Cutler, also of Montreal, played in facilitating the meeting between Begin and Sadat? He was asked to find out if Begin would be open to meeting with Sadat for peace negotiations. Then Professor Cutler met with Begin and got the assurance. And then he met his future wife, Ariella, who is also very well known to the community in Montreal, who helped setting up the meeting. So thank you very much, Lillian, for this beautiful comment that brings Montreal also very much into the conversation and the history that we are discussing that we need to tell. Another question from Joseph Robinson from Montreal. And Joseph's question is as follows. I don't suppose that Tunisia has had nearly as close clandestine ties with Israel as Morocco, despite Tunisia and Morocco having similar histories with the Jews and also with the processes of French colonization, especially considering that Tunisia hosted the PLO in most of the 90s, most of the 80s. Jonathan, do you have any comments on Tunisia and the Tunisia-Morocco comparison?
Yes, I do actually. I think it's Tunisia very important country in that respect, as Habib Bourguiba was the first Arab leader to openly support the partition plan between Israel and between actually a Jewish state and an Arab state. It's actually the first one to acknowledge Israel existence de facto, not the jury stated that Israel that the Arab states should have accepted the partition plan in 1947. He made his speech in Jericho in 1966. Which actually was quite formidable, given the fact that at this time, even the idea of accepting Israel existence in the Arab state, in the Arab world, was taboo. So Tunisia had actually an history of being supportive, at least partially supportive of Israel's existence and of potential negotiations. And in 1986, there were some. I've read a report from the INS. I'm not sure if it's from the INSS, that Shlomo Gazit, the then head of military intelligence, met with PLO officials in Tunis when they were indeed when they had their headquarters based in Tunis. And Tunisia actually established diplomatic relations, partial diplomatic relations with Israel in 1996, but unfortunately severed these relations in 2000 and haven't actually renewed it. And since then, they have taken a more I would say, a hostile approach towards Israel in comparison to before.
Thank you very much. Another question from Mr. Paul Landy. How did the migration of Moroccan Jews to Israel in the 1950s influence the attitude of King Hassan and Morocco in general towards Israel in the subsequent years? Very important question about the role of immigration.
My actually research mainly focused on the period actually succeeding. In the aftermath of the immigration waves, but the fact actually that there were a vibrant Jewish community in Morocco, which played also a significant role in even in the royal court, in the monarchy itself. But I think that the main episode actually, which is important, I think, is the egos, which happened, I think, under King Hassan, which proved that there were connections between Israel, between the Mossad and Morocco on these ways of immigration of American Jews to Israel.
Jonathan, many but not everyone around the table would know the history or the story of the Egos. Just in 2 sentences, can you just remind the audience what that reference was to?
Yes, so the Egos actually was a ship which unfortunately have on board Jews which were emigrating from Morocco to Israel, and this ship actually sank in the ocean. And as a result of that tragic incident, it highlighted the already established cooperation between Israel and the Mossad on the Aliyah, actually on promoting Aliyah from Morocco to Israel.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We have a question from one of our students, Nathan Azrieli, who is raising a following important question about looking into the future. Do you think we could see in the next years a normalization of ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia, since Mohammed bin Salman seems very interested in the Israeli technologies? And we also have a question coming in from Mr. Malik, who would like to ask you if you see relations being established with Pakistan.
Okay, these are two very important questions. As for Saudi Arabia, indeed, there is a cleavage between Mohammed bin Salman, who is more keener to establish relations with Israel. I've made statement in that direction, and King Salman, who is more attached to the old Arab policy vis-a-vis Israel. King Salman stated that Saudi Arabia will not normalize relations unless Israel agrees to the Arab Peace Initiative. But actually, Mohammed bin Salman indeed is less attached to the Palestinian issue than his father, and we could actually envisage a normalization of ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel once Mohammed bin Salman come to power. But at the same time, there are some some issues, as Saudi Arabia is the guardian of the custodian of Mecca and Medina, and they are still actually influenced by their own public opinion, which is changing, indeed, and is becoming more supportive of normalization of relations with Israel. But at the same time, they are much more cautious and will probably move slower. They will actually make some gesture towards normalization. Perhaps it happened in the past when they opened their airspace to Air India, but also more recently when the Israeli delegation flew to the UAE to meet with their UAE counterparts. The Israeli airline flew over Saudi airspace. So these Saudi authorities have opened up their airspace to all Israeli airliners, civilian airliners, and I think we'll see an increase of friendly gestures toward Israel, but not normalization at this stage. I think the normalization will perhaps take place when Mohammed bin Salman, who has a completely different vision vis-a-vis this issue, will come to power. As for Pakistan, I don't foresee any relations at this moment, given the fact that Israel also maintained close relations with India. Pakistan is not keen on normalizing relations unless there would be significant progress in the peace process, and I don't see it happening in the near future.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I see one more question coming from the audience, and it's a follow-up question from Professor Ben Susan, who would like to ask you to please elaborate on the secret meetings before 1973.
Secret meetings between, you mean from during which period of time? Can you specify?
Before 1973.
You mean between General Oufkir and Mayor Hamid, or because there were several meetings, but I
think that's what Professor Ben Susan is referring to. Yeah, that you started at the beginning. Yeah.
Yes, the meetings were mainly centered around the security establishment establishing security apparatus in Morocco. I think the main reason was to, as I've mentioned in the presentation, was to have Israel being in charge of all the security arrangements in the palace. Also, the meetings referred to the arms sales of Israeli arms sales to Morocco, but also the training of its personnel and air crews. I think this is mainly related to the security issue. I'm not actually. Most of the details of these meetings are kept secret and were not available in the archives. Unlike the meeting, for instance, between Touami and Hassan and Moshe Dayan. But I would posit that all the meetings were related to security issues, but there were also, I think, a few meetings which included Chaim Herzog, who met with King Hassan to discuss the investment of British Jewish family, the Wolfson family, in the kingdom. And the Deputy Defense Minister actually met with the king to discuss potential agricultural cooperation, especially the sale of citrus to Israel.
Great. Thank you so much, Jonathan. I'm looking around and scrolling up and down in the chat box. I think these were all the questions. So thank you so much, Jonathan. You've been wonderful. Thank you for keeping to the agreed time limit. And thank you so much for sharing your wealth of wisdom and knowledge, historical understanding, and entertaining all the questions with so much detail as you have. Thank you very, very much. We look forward to continued engagement with you during your stay in the upcoming months at the Azrieli Institute, and we wish you best of luck with your project, especially the book manuscript that you're working on. So all best of luck. And ladies and gentlemen, before I would let you go, I am going to try to share my screen. Jonathan, let me ask you to stop your screen sharing. Thank you so much, so that I could show you slides about our upcoming events. Please join us again next week on October 20th for another talk by another junior scholar who is visiting us virtually at the Azrieli Institute. The talk will be by Lilach Ben-Tzvi, who is a freshly minted PhD from the University of Haifa, who will be discussing the implications of Shomer Chomot and the difficult riots that engulfed Israel in that context. And she will put this in the context of trying to make sense of the difficult relations between Jews and Arabs in Israel, especially in the mixed cities, by casting the very important theoretical framework borrowed from Yeshayahu Leibovich. So those of you who are interested in political philosophy, political thinking, as well as current events, please join us for this fascinating discussion by Lilach. And then later on in the month, we'll have a book launch. We will be celebrating the recent publication of the book on by Dr. Rachel Blumenthal, Right to Reparations. Rachel is telling a fascinating history of the Claims Conference, and joining us at the panel will be two scholars from Germany, Austria, Dr. Michael Brenner and Dr. Noam Zadov, two scholars, specialists of Israeli-German relations and Israel studies more broadly. We will close the month on October 31st with a film screening. As always, our films are free of charge. You just have to register, and then we'll send you the link. The film will be Our Natural Right. In this film, in this documentary, the filmmakers are reconnecting with family members of Israeli leaders who signed the Declaration of Independence. And they want to ask them the crucial question, where have we come? And the range of answers that we are exposed to is fascinating. So please join us. And then the day after the film, on November 1st, we will be engaging the three movie makers, Yuria Cohen, Udi Nir, and Sagi Borstein, in what is going to be a fascinating conversation. So I'm only going to say farewell, hopefully until next week, when I hope to see many of you again virtually on the screen at Lilach's presentation. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us. Jonathan, thank you so much again for bringing your wealth of knowledge to our screen and to our community. So long, everyone. Lehitraot and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.